Hello and welcome back to my world of stuff. My name, it be Paul Mount. Today I'm going to pose a little question. What do you think is the best science fiction film franchise of all time? Not necessarily your favourite, although I accept that the difference between your favourite and your best, there's probably not going to be a lot of difference. They're probably going to be much the same because the one you think is best is probably going to be your favourite. You may be a fan of Star Wars or Star Trek or Back to the Future or Alien or Dune, or even the Marvel films, I suppose, could be considered as a science fiction franchise. But my contention is that the best science fiction franchise in the film world is Planet of the Apes. Started in 1968, run of 5 films that finished in 1974, laid fallow for a while and came back triumphantly in the 21st century. I think it's the best science fiction franchise because it is my favourite, and I'm going to tell you exactly why. I was inspired to do this particular video on discovering that the original 1968 Planet of the Apes film is currently streaming on Disney Plus in 4K. It's been released on various formats over the years, VHS, DVD, it's available on Blu-ray, but it's not commercially available on 4K as yet. And I thought, well, it's a film I can watch anytime because it is so good. And I thought I would take a little look at it again. And I was going to do a video just on that film, almost like a first impressions type thing of the first in that series of films. But then I thought there's probably a bit more currency in doing something about the whole 5-film series, because this is a series which exists today. As I mentioned in the introduction, we had this run of 5 films that were made in rapid succession. Then we had a TV series, a cartoon series, the failed Tim Burton reboot around 2000. And now it's back. We've had 4 new Apes films in this century, and this is a franchise that I feel has, by and large, not really dropped the ball. It's not jumped the shark, as they say. I think if you take Tim Burton's film out of the equation, because that doesn't really fit into any Apes timeline or chronology, I think that all these films are hugely entertaining. The modern films, certainly the first 3, are absolute classics. I do enjoy Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, the first of the new trilogy, but I think we probably need to see where the series is going to fully appreciate that one. But I will contend here and now that those first 5 films are a fantastic body of work, hugely imaginative, creative, visually stunning, most of them made on very small budgets, as we shall discover. Each of them successful financially in their own way, but they created this legacy of storytelling and science fiction world building, which I don't think has been equaled in the years since they were made. For all the advances in technology and the amazing visual things that can be done these days, I think that these original 5 Planet of the Apes films, and they're not all fantastic, there's bumps along the way, but I think, and as a whole, they are a fantastic saga that's unrivaled in sci-fi cinema. Let me tell you why I think that. The Planet of the Apes story starts in 1963 with the publication of the original Planet of the Apes book. I think it was called Planet des Singes, because it was in French. It was written by French author Pierre Boulle, who wrote 2 books which have cemented his place in history, Planet of the Apes and A Bridge Over the River Kwai, which he wrote in 1952. Planet of the Apes, by its nature, was a story that was bound to attract the attention of filmmakers. The book, I've not read the book, but I know that it is very different to the films in that the society of apes in the future is much more based on modern world. I think that the apes have businesses and they wear suits and they indulge in commerce and so on. It's not the slightly more primitive culture that we see in the films. But the very idea of a planet ruled by apes, and at this point it was a planet rather than Earth, was fascinating to filmmakers. And it was particularly attractive to a film producer born in 1922, Arthur P. Jacobs. In the 60s, he set up his own film production company, Apjac Limited, and they produced films such as Goodbye Mr. Chips, Dr. Dolittle, Played Again, Sam and Tom Sawyer, hits and flops in amongst their titles. But Jacobs was fascinated by the idea of the Planet of the Apes, and he wanted to secure the rights, and he thought it would be a fantastic idea for a science fiction film. The problem was nobody was very interested because budgetarily it looked as if this was going to cost about $10 million, and nobody was really prepared to fund a film to that degree back in those days. And it's amazing looking back to the 60s when they made films and today's inflated budgets. We hear about films now with budgets of 200 million, 300 million that have got to make $1 billion to make a profit. Back in the 60s and 70s, studios were a little less profligate and a bit more cautious with their money. And nobody in the world was prepared to put $10 million up front for a science fiction film about talking monkeys. And I think you can possibly understand why. Because science fiction wasn't exactly in the doldrums at the time. I think science fiction was probably still regarded as B-movies, monsters and aliens and ray guns and spaceships and so on. Planet of the Apes was never that, as we were to discover. Jacobs spent over 3 years trying to persuade various filmmakers to take up this particular project. A number of different artists were engaged, creating test sketches of what the apes would look like. The veteran television writer Rod Serling, who had been responsible for the classic Twilight Zone series, he turned in a script which contained some elements of the original novel, including certain Cold War themes. It was Serling who created that infamous twist ending in the first film, which I will come to in due course. The tide eventually turned for the film when Jacobs and his associate producer Mort Abrams persevered, because they felt that this was a great idea for a film, had so much potential, and I think they eventually made headway when they persuaded Charlton Heston to star in the film. Although Heston's career was slightly in the doldrums at the time, he'd been well known early in films like The Ten Commandments because he had that physicality about him and that commanding presence. And I think the fact that he was interested in the film got the wheels turning a little bit. He suggested Franklin J. Schaffer as a possible director for the film. A brief screen test was recorded featuring Heston, and 20th Century Fox ultimately bit and felt that the film had a chance of being successful with this sort of pedigree. The first film, then, Planet of the Apes, was released on April the 3rd, 1968, directed by Franklin J. Schaffer, with a script by Rod Serling, with some additional material from Michael Wilson. Watching the film now, I watched it last week on 4K on Disney+, and it's a film that is as powerful now as it was back in the 60s. I mean, we're used to the spectacular stuff that we get in science fiction films these days. We're not quite used to a sophisticated script. And Planet of the Apes has a sophisticated script and very impressive visuals for the era in which it was made. The film was eventually budgeted at $5.8 million. And as a result, it isn't a huge spectacle, but it's visually stunning. The film introduces us to astronauts Taylor, Landon and Dodge. Don't worry about Landon and Dodge, they're not around for long. They awaken from deep hibernation in their spaceship after a near light-speed space voyage. Their spacecraft crashes into a lake, what they think is an unknown uncharted planet. Taylor estimates that they are somewhere in the Orion's Bellatrix system, 300 light years from their home solar system. They've been in hibernation for an extended period. One of their number, the female member of the group, Stewart, has died. Something's gone wrong with her cryogenic chamber and she's aged to death. The ship itself, having crashed in a lake, sinks, and Taylor, Landon and Dodge escape and start exploring this barren, desolate, rocky landscape. The cinematography is absolutely stunning here. It's absolutely beautiful. It really makes the most of the incredible alien-looking landscape of barren rock and great vistas of mountains in the distance and this dazzlingly blue, clear sky. It's absolutely astonishing, especially on 4K. You just notice the difference, as you always do on 4K. It's absolutely superb. Travelling across this landscape, the three of them form the view that this is an uninhabited planet. They find signs of life, vegetation and so on, and then they're slightly startled to see these eerie scarecrow-like figures on the cliffs nearby, and they find this huge lake area with lush vegetation all around it. They strip off and dive into the lake, but their clothes are stolen while they're swimming. They soon discover that the planet is actually populated by a race of what appear to be mute humans, just in bare, simple clothes. They then discover something far worse when this, what appears to be this nomadic tribe of wandering mute humans, is attacked by apes on horseback. This is still a thrilling and incredibly well put together scene, which was recreated to an extent in the most recent Apes film. It's really well done, and it's one of the action scenes of the film. There are a couple of action scenes, but not in the sense that we have them today with people hurtling through the air and huge CGI battles. This is just a very visceral, very rough and quite disturbing scene of these humans being hunted by these monkeys, these apes, gorillas on horseback. And they have prods and they have sticks and nets and they're capturing humans and they're beating them to the ground. Basically, they're brutalizing them and torturing them. Our heroes get caught up in this, but they get separated. And as the attack wears on, more and more of the humans are captured. There's sequences where they fall off this cliff into the ravine, and this is where the main characters are separated once and for all. Landon and Dodge are ultimately out of the equation. Taylor himself, Charlton Heston, shot in the throat so he can't speak. He is then taken along with other humans to Ape City, which is this huge, very impressive set of a number of dwellings, primitive-looking stone dwellings with walkways and paths underneath. Taylor attracts the attention of a couple of scientists, Cornelius and Zyra, and Taylor is desperate to show that he can speak, but he's lost his voice because of his injury, and he observes from his cage that there is a caste system amongst the ape, gorillas being the military forces, orangutans are the overseers, they're sort of the government, and intellectual chimpanzees are mainly scientists and doctors. Whilst he's in captivity, he becomes close to one of the mute human females named Nova. Ultimately, Taylor manages to effect an escape from captivity, and he escapes out into the city, but he's caught again, which leads to that absolutely classic Planet of the Apes moments.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
Which is as iconic a line in cinema dialogue as I think there's ever been. The situation then progresses in a very measured and intellectual style. As I said, it's not an action film. There's a lot of talking about humanity and the fact that the apes cannot understand how this human has the ability to speak when the rest of humankind is mute. Ultimately, Taylor forms an unlikely friendship with Zyra and Cornelius. Cornelius has already been fascinated by the so-called Forbidden Zone. This is the area where Taylor and Dodge and Landon saw the scarecrow creatures earlier on. And he is fascinated by the idea of an intelligence and a civilization that existed pre-simians. Dr. Zayas, the leader of the community, he tries to warn Cornelius away from this, warns them that no good will come from looking into the past. However, along with Taylor, Zyra and Cornelius voyage into this area. Cornelius has been exploring this sort of thing before. He has this archaeological expedition that he's previously set up. There's a confrontation between Zyra and Cornelius and Dr. Zayas, who again is trying to tell them to keep away from the past. Past is not a good place to look into. As far as Taylor is concerned, he has already seen evidence that there has been a human civilization on the planet. He's seen artifacts that he recognises, dentures, eyeglasses, a doll. And he and Cornelius and Zyra realised that there was a society, a human society on this planet before apes rose up and took control. As Taylor and Nova ride off, Zayas orders the archaeological excavation to be blown up. The secrets of the past should remain in the past. But of course, in a classic ending to the film, and I apologise if this is a spoiler for anybody, but really, this film came out in 1968. Taylor and Nova ride off across the coast, and we see the remains of the Statue of Liberty rising out of the surf. And Taylor realises that he's not on an alien planet, he's on Earth, and that the civilization that has risen after the mankind has destroyed itself. And again, another classic moment when Taylor jumps off his horse, falls into the surf and cries out, "God damn it, you blew it up." It's absolutely astonishing. Planet of the Apes, watching it again now, is as good as it's ever been. It's intelligent, it's intellectual, it asks questions about humanity and civilization, society, and even questions about vivisection, with the themes of Taylor being experimented on as if he's an animal. But it's so beautifully made, it looks so fresh, and watching it now, it's so nice to watch a film that isn't all bluster and bang and flash. It has character, it has story, it has intelligence to it. It's a thrilling film to watch. It was a big success at the box office, no doubt in large part to the incredible ape makeup effects from John Chambers, who worked relentlessly to create a really inspiring and believable look to the apes. And you look at it now, and these face masks are still extremely good. They have motion and movement. You get the actors' eyes behind the masks and their mouths. That does a lot of the legwork in making the masks seem believable, because they look like chimpanzees and orangutans and gorillas, but an evolved version of them, obviously, because they can speak and emote. The makeup is absolutely astonishing. The film was a huge success. On its budget of 5.8 million, it made 33.3 million worldwide at the box office. That might not seem like a lot of money by today's standards, where films have to make $500 million to make a profit. But this was back in 1968. 5.8 million was considered a risky proposition, so it was enormously successful. And it's not surprising that 20th Century Fox wanted a sequel. There were some issues here, however. Charlton Heston had no interest in coming back for a sequel. He'd never done sequels. He didn't want to be tied to one particular character or one particular genre. But he was persuaded to come back when it was agreed that he would be written out of the second film quite quickly and would eventually be killed off, so he couldn't be called back into action again. Consequently, Beneath the Planet of the Apes was released in May 1970, just over 2 years after the first film. This was directed by Ted Post, with the screenplay by Paul Dane, who is now drafted in as the new scriptwriter, and he would in fact write the next 2 films in the series. The film started off following on almost immediately from the events of the first film, with Taylor and Nova riding along the coast. They eventually come across a strange phenomenon out in the wilderness, and Taylor disappears to reappear at the end of the film. Meanwhile, a new astronaut crashes on the Planet of the Apes in search of Taylor. This is Brent, and we go through familiar story beats as he comes across this ape culture, this ape civilization. It's halfway through the film when he ends up in an old subway station that he realises that he's not on an alien planet, he's on Earth. Eventually, the film introduces these mutants, these underground mutants who are the survivors of the atomic war that levelled humanity. And they are guarding their god, which is a massive nuclear warhead. And these are deformed mutants whose faces are atrophied and they're scarred, and they wear hoods to protect themselves. And they are eventually in conflict with ape kind, who invade their domain. Taylor meets up with Brent, and it all ends up catastrophically with the bomb going off, and the Earth is blown apart. It's destroyed. End of the Planet of the Apes saga, except that wasn't to be the case, of course. Despite the success of the first film, whereas these days a sequel would have a bigger budget than the first film, Fox wanted the second film on a smaller budget. It was budgeted at 2.5 million. I think it was probably manageable because, of course, the makeup was there. You had Ape City, the sets and props were there, so they could lower those initial costs of making the new film. But it was still a success, not to the extent of the first film. Beneath the Planet of the Apes made $19 million, still a significant return on a film with a budget of 2.5. A sequel was demanded, and again, you look back at this and think, they made these films presumably fairly quickly, put them out, they were successful, they'd get another one made, and these films now came out every year. There was a 2-year gap between Planet of the Apes and Beneath the Planet of the Apes, but now these films came out every summer for the next 3 years. The third film came out May the 21st, 1971, which was literally a year after the second film. This was Escape from the Planet of the Apes, directed now by Don Taylor, again written by Paul Dane. This is the first Apes film that I actually saw at the cinema. I saw this when I was on holiday as a nipper in Torquay in Devon. And I'd not seen the previous Planet of the Apes films. I was surely aware of them, but wouldn't have seen them by now. But I went to see this film, and I remember being utterly entranced by it, because this is a film with a lower budget again. This was now budgeted at 2 million. And this is a film which turns things on its head and starts to create what we see as the sort of Apes timeline, if you like. In this particular film, Zira and Cornelius have escaped from the destruction on the Planet of the Apes. They have found Taylor's spaceship from the first film, managed to repair it, and they have left Earth before it's destroyed. Roddy McDowall is back in this film. He had played Cornelius in the first film, but not in the second film, and he now becomes forever associated with the rest of the Planet of the Apes film series. He was very committed to it, very determined that it should have a believability to it and a continuity to it. And this film sees our ape heroes travelling back to the 1970s. They arrive off the coast of California, and talking apes are something of a novelty, something of a phenomenon, and they become celebrities, media celebrities. And I think this is an early depiction of the sort of celebrity culture that we have these days, this novelty of something new and something different that captures the public imagination. But what works against Zira and Cornelius here is that they reveal in an unguarded moment what actually happened to the Earth. They have explained about the ape culture in the future and how it led to the destruction of the Earth. And understandably, the government are a little bit concerned about this, and they want to put a stop to it. They want to change the future. Zira becomes pregnant, and She, the baby, and Cornelius are forced to go on the run when they learn that the government plan to assassinate them to stop the future from happening. They do escape, but at a cost. Their baby appears to be killed, but that is not the case. I think it's the first time that the Planet of the Apes films have a sort of an emotional core to it, particularly at the end, because it's quite comedic in places and quite light, with this always fascinating fish out of water thing with these intelligent, articulate apes from the future in the modern day or the early 1970s. But then it becomes increasingly disturbing when we see the way things are going, that the apes can't really be allowed to live and breed if it's going to lead to the future that we've heard about. And the ending is quite gritty and tough, where Zyra and Cornelius and the baby have holed up in this massive ship in a dockyard and they're hunted down, and it's quite tragic. But we see the germs of the future towards the end of the film, when it appears that Caesar has not been killed and he's in a zoo somewhere and he starts to speak. Film again was a success. On a budget of 2 million, it took 12.3 million, so we can see that the returns are diminishing as the films go along. But a fourth film was requested. This came out just over a year after the third film. This was Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. This was directed by J. Lee Thompson with a script by Paul Dane. This was made on a budget of just 1.7 million. And if you look at the film, it's hard to imagine that was all it cost, because it's pretty spectacular. It's set in a near future where humans have turned apes into slaves following the death of all traditional domestic pets. Caesar, who's the child from the end of the previous film, he's now grown into an adult. He's played by Roger McDowell, of course, and he leads the apes from their bondage to lead a rebellion against humankind. It's a very spectacular film. A lot of it was filmed in and around Century City. The walkways and buildings and skyscrapers, a very futuristic looking setting today, as it was in 1972 in fact. But it looks really big and epic for a film made on a very small budget. There's lots of action scenes, there's lots of extras, there's lots of fight scenes with loads of people in ape masks, and it's quite a savage and brutal film. It continues the film's layered storytelling in that there are themes quite vividly portrayed here about racial conflict. The apes wear different coloured costumes, and the whole idea of segregation and apes being used as slaves. I mean, it might not be subtle, but it's on point, and for a film made in 1972, at the time when racial tensions were quite high in America, it's quite a bold and brave thing to do in a science fiction film. But science fiction is about making statements about things. It's about being aware. It's about having social conscience. It's about being woke, I suppose, which people complain about these days. But there are ways and degrees of doing it. And I think that these Apes films had this theme of racism running pretty much through the entire series of original films. The film wasn't particularly well reviewed. I mean, they hadn't really been well reviewed since the first film. But it still turned a profit on its budget of 1.7 million, made a profit of 9.7. So even though the big bucks weren't coming in, it was turning a decent profit. So unsurprisingly, a fifth film was required. And I think it was planned that it would be the last film. I think that everybody realised that they were running on borrowed time. And a year later, Battle for the Planet of the Apes, budgeted at 1.7 million, was released to bring the series to an end. And it did, in fact, bring the series to quite a nice rounded conclusion. It's clear that there's a lower budget here. It feels, for the first time, it feels as if there's not a lot of money to go around, because it feels smaller and it feels less expansive, and it feels as if things are running out of steam. The story here follows with Caesar a few years later as he leads the apes and their human subjects after a devastating war that's destroyed much of the planet. This was the consequence of the end of Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, where the humans were fighting back against the apes who were rising up against them. He has two problems to contend with here. One, there's a threat of rebellion within his own ranks. His own son is put in danger. And there's an attack by radiation-scarred human survivors who are bearing down on the ape city with a view to destroying the apes. It does bring the series to an end in quite an emotive and striking way. A lot of people have commented on the ambiguous final scene of the film. 700 years after the main events of the film, the last scene depicts a statue of Caesar, which sheds a single tear as the figure of the lawgiver recounts Caesar's story to an audience of apes and human children. One interpretation here is that the statue cries tears of joy because the two species have broken this cycle of war and battle and oppression. which gives us sort of an optimistic finale to the whole series. But the other reading, I think, which is equally valid, is that the statue weeps because there is still racial strife, and the dystopian future that we saw in the first couple of films is unavoidable, despite the efforts of everybody within the cycle of these films to try and change things for the better. So it's both optimistic and pessimistic, and I think that's sums up the series in a way. It's pessimistic in that the world is ultimately destroyed, but there's an optimism here in that the situation that moves towards this offers possibilities that doesn't have to be the way. Ultimately, Battle, even though it's the weakest of the films, did well at the box office. 1.7 million budget, and it made 8.8 million. But what was clear here is that the films were declining in popularity. Audiences were coming, but not in the same numbers as the first film. They never reached the heights of the first film, but they were profitable in themselves. It was a profitable series, but I think Fox were wise to pull the plug when they did, and I think that the film does give the series a poignant and thought-provoking ending, and being thought-provoking is what the Apes series was all about from that very first film. Wasn't, however, the end of Planet of the Apes on screen. As we know, there was a TV series launched a year later. There was still felt to be money to be made from the Apes franchise, so the whole situation was regurgitated for a series that debuted in September 1974, screened between 8 and 9 p.m. on CBS in America. It was a similar story. Two astronauts, Verdon and Burke, landed on Earth, discovered that they were on a planet ruled by apes, and the series adopted a format which was popular on sci-fi TV in America at that time. It was a narrative of people on the run, a fugitive. In series like Logan's Run and Fantastic Journey, people in a strange place, moving across different zones and different areas, meeting different communities and helping them out. And that's what this particular series did. Verdon and Burke found themselves on the run, chased by the vicious General Urko, played by Mark Leonard. They teamed up with a friendly chimp, Galen, played again by Roddy McDowall, and they were fleeing from capture, but every episode they went to a different community which had a different problem. Difference here was that the humans could speak. This throws a massive spanner in the works of Planet of the Apes chronology, but you can understand why they did it, because you couldn't have a whole series with non-speaking human characters. You had to build the drama and the situations with other people in the episodes. The series wasn't successful. It was pulled after 14 episodes. Ratings were low, and I think generally it's felt that it wasn't very well thought through. I think that they just thought that the same format would work as it worked for the earlier films. But it was too episodic. Characters weren't very interesting. Storylines weren't very thrilling. There were a couple of decent episodes. The opening episode was quite promising. I think it's called Escape into Tomorrow. And I'm not going to say too much about this series because I'm probably going to do a first impressions on that first episode. And there was a good episode called The Trap, which saw Urko and the humans trapped in an old underground subway, and this had some decent scenes of sort of desolate cityscapes and so on, so that had that bit more of that post-apocalyptic feel. Series was massive in the UK though. It was shown on Sunday nights, and I seem to recall it having ratings of around 14, 15, 16 million at the time, when that was a very good figure on terrestrial TV. And it's not the only example of an American show being massively popular over here but failing stateside. Of course, the plug was pulled, and that was the end of that for a while. I'm going to leave it there for now. What I will do is backtrack and rate the Apes series. Planet of the Apes, the original film, is still a masterpiece, and that gets a 10 out of 10 from me. Beneath the Planet of the Apes is an interesting successor. It obviously hasn't got the shock and the surprise of the original, but I think it's nice to be back in that world, and I think James Franciscus is a decent leading man. But I'm going to give that 6 out of 10. Escape to the Planet of the Apes, as I mentioned, is the first one I saw in the cinema, and I really liked that film. It's very engaging, and it's very witty, and it's tragic. It has that tragic ending, and I'm going to give that an 8 out of 10. Conquest of the Planet of the Apes comes next, and as I say, that's a really powerful, violent film. It was so violent towards the end, in fact, they had to re-edit certain scenes. I think there was a particularly brutal death sequence that had to be tamed down a little bit, and I think Roddy McDowall came back to voiceover to cover what had been deleted. Very powerful film, visually very arresting, very striking in this filming in Century City, this sort of soulless concrete jungle. But that gets from me 8 out of 10. And then the series ends with Battle for the Planet of the Apes. I haven't seen that for some time. In fact, I did a rewatch of the Apes films a few years ago, and it didn't get around to Battle for the Planet of the Apes. So I need to rewatch it. But at the moment, I'm going to give that a 5 out of 10. It's a great series, and as I said, in my opinion, it is the best science fiction franchise, because I think there's something fascinating about this core idea, insane as it is, of an intelligent civilization of apes growing to dominance on the earth. But it's about more than that. It's about humanity. It's about the way we treat animals and humans and each other. It's about so many things, and I think you take from it what you will, because there's so much going on in these films, particularly Planet of the Apes, which, as I say, is the one that started me off on this video. It's on Disney in 4K at the moment. If you've got 4K capacity and capability, it looks beautiful. So that's the Planet of the Apes films, the original Planet of the Apes quadrilogy. Is that a word? Quintology? I can't remember. 5 great films, all entertaining by different degrees in different ways, and time spent on the Planet of the Apes, frankly, is never time wasted. Right, thank you for watching this video. If you have any particular memories or thoughts about the Planet of the Apes series, why not leave a comment down below? What are your favourites of the 5 films? I will, of course, return to the modern films some point in the future, but I just wanted to cast my mind back and just remind you of how great these films were, and how you can make great science fiction films without a great deal of money, or at least you could back in the 60s and 70s. It just still astounds me to think that these films were made for less than $2 million. I mean, that's obviously a lot of money for an individual, but for a big science fiction film, it's peanuts, and you wouldn't think of doing it today. I think that shows, as much as anything, how filmmaking has changed over the years, and how priorities have changed, and how audiences' expectations are different. But back in the 70s, you could make a really spectacular modern science fiction film on $2-3 million. I love the Planet of the Apes films almost unconditionally. As I said, I'm conscious of the failings of the ones that aren't as good as the others, but I think the whole saga hangs together really well and is visually stunning, even in its weaker moments. So there we are. As I said, let me know what you think of these films, what your thoughts are about the apes, and of course, stick around if you're new to the channel. Please do the like and subscribe thing. I think the statistics are currently showing that just under 50% of my views are from subscribers, which isn't bad by YouTube standards, actually. But it would be nice to get all of you subscribers watching all of the videos, because they're only a few minutes long, and it's only a few minutes out of your day. So please stick around, like and subscribe, watch the videos, leave a comment, and I'll see you soon until I do. If you want one of these t-shirts, by the way, there's a link down below where you can purchase one very reasonably. I will see you soon until I do. Keep taking the stuff.